was Elvis like?
He was a real person.
Real man.
Yeah, he was a real person.
Yeah.
He loved people, but he had issues just like everybody else.
Yeah.
He wasn't a perfect man.
She was the quiet witness to the final decade of Elvis Presley's life. Not a star, not a relative, but the maid who saw everything. For years, Nancy Rooks said almost nothing. No interviews, no headlines. But before she died, she finally spoke. And what she revealed doesn't match the story we've always been told. Was Elvis planning a comeback or quietly preparing to vanish? This isn't a rumor. It's the voice of someone who was there. And once you hear what she saw, you may never see the king the same way again. For 10 years, from 1967 until Elvis Presley's death in 1977, Nancy worked inside Graceland. She wasn't part of the music business, didn't appear in interviews or write tell-all books back then. But she played a crucial role in the private life of one of the most famous people on the planet. Nancy wasn't hired through any showbiz connections. She came to Graceland by chance, initially brought in temporarily through a staffing agency to cover for another housekeeper who was ill. But Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, noticed her calm manner and solid work ethic and asked her to stay on. What began as a short-term placement became a long-term presence in the Presley household. Originally, her job was simply to clean the house, but her role evolved quickly. Over time, Nancy became one of Elvis's trusted cooks, preparing his favorite comfort foods, things like peanut butter and banana sandwiches, meatloaf, cornbread, and fried pickles. He often wanted meals at unusual hours, usually late at night. Nancy would typically start her shift in the early evening and work well past midnight, keeping up with Elvis's famously irregular schedule. Unlike many of the people around Elvis, Nancy wasn't there for fame. She didn't try to leverage her position for attention or money. In fact, she kept a low profile for decades. But within the walls of Graceland, she witnessed a side of Elvis few people ever saw. Elvis didn't live a typical life, and the house reflected that. He would come downstairs at odd hours, often barefoot or in his slippers, hair tousled, sometimes cheerful, sometimes quiet. Nancy adjusted to this rhythm, never pushing, always observing. Some days he'd be chatty and playful. Other days he'd just want to be left alone. And Nancy understood that, when to talk and when to step back. She wasn't just there to make meals and tidy rooms. Over time, she became part of the everyday backdrop of Elvis's life. He trusted her, not just with his routines, but with his moods, his privacy, and his quiet moments. She saw the stream of guests, famous friends, old buddies from Memphis, girlfriends, bodyguards. She saw how many people relied on Elvis, how many wanted something from him, and also how drained he sometimes looked when the house emptied out. There were times when the energy in the house would drop and everything would fall silent. In those moments, Elvis would sometimes ask Nancy to sit with him and sing gospel hymns. Nothing fancy, just soft singing in the kitchen, sometimes with his grandmother Minnie Mae joining in. For someone constantly in the public eye, these moments were personal, grounding. Nancy stayed quiet about all this for a long time. While others who had known Elvis gave interviews, wrote memoirs, or appeared on television, she kept her distance from the spotlight. When fans sent letters asking what Elvis was really like, she responded politely but rarely shared much. She kept her words simple. He was kind, he was funny, he was generous. And that was usually all she'd say. Eventually, she did decide to tell more of her story, but she did it in her own way. She wrote a few books, including The Maid, The Man, and The Fans, and Inside Graceland, offering respectful, personal accounts of her time at the mansion. These weren't dramatic exposés. They were filled with ordinary moments, details of Elvis's daily life that painted a fuller picture of who he was when no one was watching. What made Nancy's account so valuable was the tone she used. There was no bitterness, no agenda. Her stories were told with care and without exaggeration. She didn't try to make herself the center of the narrative. Instead, she allowed readers to glimpse Elvis through her eyes, up close, but with respect. She talked about how Elvis liked his meals served, how he'd request peach cobbler on a whim, or how he'd suddenly decide to throw a party in the middle of the night. She described how the staff had to adapt to his unique routines, his late nights and unpredictable moods. And she recalled the quieter, more vulnerable sides of him, the man who sometimes looked tired even when surrounded by people, or the man who sat alone, deep in thought. Nancy didn't shy away from the reality that being close to Elvis came with challenges. There were strict boundaries. His moods could shift quickly. There were rules in the house, some unspoken, some very clear. But she also made it clear that he treated her with kindness. He respected her role and appreciated what she did. That mutual trust helped her become one of the few people who lasted so long in the inner circle. In many ways, Nancy was invisible to the public eye. She didn't wear sparkly clothes, she didn't appear in magazine spreads, but she was there for a decade, in the kitchen, in the halls, on the stairs, watching the life of a cultural icon unfold one day at a time. When Elvis died in 1977, Nancy was still working at Graceland. She had been there through the peak of his fame, through the long tours, and through the slow decline that preceded his passing. Her account of those final days would come much later, but it was shaped by all the years she spent simply being there, quietly observing and caring for the man behind the myth. What's clear from her recollections is that Nancy didn't see Elvis as a king or a legend. She saw him as a person, someone with routines, preferences, good days and bad. That grounded view is part of what makes her story so compelling. Her position at Graceland wasn't glamorous, but it was intimate. She handled his clothes, cooked his food, cleaned up after his friends, and knew what time he liked to eat breakfast, even if it was at 5 in the evening. And while others came and went, she stayed. She became part of the rhythm of his life, adjusting to his world rather than trying to shape it. In time, her name became known among serious Elvis fans, not because she sought fame, but because her words carried weight. They were quiet, but they rang true. And when she finally did speak out, people listened, not because they expected scandal, but because they knew she had something real to say. Elvis Presley, still known as the King of Rock and Roll, was preparing to go back on tour. He had dates on the calendar, bags being packed, and a team ready to hit the road again. But while he kept moving forward on the surface, those around him could see that something deeper was going on. Nancy Rooks, who had worked at Graceland for a decade by that point, saw the changes clearly. She'd been part of Elvis's daily routine for years, cooking his meals, keeping the house in order, and quietly observing the rhythm of his life. And in those final weeks, she noticed the small things. How he sat down more slowly, how his appetite changed, how he seemed more withdrawn, even while still making plans. There were still moments of humor and music. Elvis could still joke around, still pull people into a spontaneous gospel session in the living room, still play racquetball on the court behind the house. But something in his energy was different. He looked tired, not just physically, but in a way that was harder to define. Nancy wasn't the only one who noticed it, but she was one of the few who saw it up close every day. His schedule was as unpredictable as ever. Elvis had always lived on his own time. He'd sleep during the day and stay up deep into the night, often watching TV or playing music in the early hours. Nancy adjusted to that routine, often preparing what most people would consider breakfast long after midnight. In those final weeks, though, the unpredictability seemed to increase. Some nights he barely ate. Other nights he'd ask for full meals. He was restless, sometimes talkative, other times pacing through the house silently. One place where Elvis spent a lot of time in those days was the upstairs bathroom. It became something of a sanctuary. No one disturbed him there unless absolutely necessary. It was more than a space for privacy. It was a space where he could be completely alone. For someone constantly surrounded by people, even in his own home, that room gave him distance from everything. The staff didn't ask questions. They simply learned to wait. Nancy didn't interpret any of this as a sign that Elvis had given up. She saw a man who was tired, yes, but still trying. He was moving, making decisions, still performing, still talking about the future. He was far from defeated. But she also saw that he was in pain, that his energy was fading more quickly, and that the demands of his world were wearing him down in a quiet, steady way. The night before he died, Elvis played racquetball. That fact has been included in most accounts of his final hours. It's often mentioned as proof that he was still active, still engaged in life. And it's true. He played hard, he laughed, he sweated through the game. He joked with his bodyguards. He talked about future plans. From the outside, nothing seemed especially unusual. Nancy remembered seeing him that night and into the early morning hours. He was standing on the steps just outside the kitchen. He had just come in from the game, looking a bit tired but fully alert. She asked him, as she often did, if he wanted something to eat. "You want something to eat, Mr. Elvis?" she said. And he shook his head. "No, I don't want anything to eat now. I just want to get some sleep." But then he added, "What I would like is some water." It was a small moment, something ordinary. Nancy didn't think much of it at the time. She asked another staff member, Pauline, to bring him a jug of water. It was one of those plastic jugs with a handle on the side, the kind usually used for juice. Pauline handed it to him, and Elvis grabbed it and drank it fast, like he hadn't had anything in days. Pauline later said, "I ain't never knowed him to grab that water and drink it like he drank it this morning." Nancy brushed it off. He'd just played racquetball. He was hot, maybe dehydrated. It made sense. At least it did at the time. That quiet moment, a man asking for water after a late-night game, turned out to be the last time Nancy spoke to Elvis. He didn't ask for anything more. He didn't complain. He didn't show any signs of distress. He simply wanted to go upstairs and rest. Later that morning, Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée, found him in the bathroom, unresponsive. What followed was chaos. Screams, panicked calls, paramedics rushing in. But for Nancy, one moment stuck with her more than any of that. It was the calmness before it all. That final exchange. That last glass of water. She would later describe it as the sound that echoed the loudest, the absence of sound. No speeches, no signs, just a man heading upstairs after a normal night. It was so unremarkable at the time that it didn't feel like anything important. But in hindsight, it meant everything. It was the end of a routine that had gone on for years. Elvis didn't collapse in front of a crowd. He didn't leave behind a dramatic message. He went quietly, in the early hours of the morning, in the home he'd made for himself. And for Nancy, that simplicity made it even more powerful. She hadn't seen it coming. None of them had. Because to the people inside the house, it just felt like another day. In the years that followed, Nancy thought often about those last few days. She replayed the little things, the tone of his voice, the way he moved, the look in his eyes. There were no big warnings, no final gestures. Just a sense, in retrospect, that something had been shifting beneath the surface. Even in the privacy of Graceland, Elvis had very few places where he could just be himself. The bathroom upstairs became one of them. Not because it was grand or comfortable, but because it was closed off. It was his own space. And in those final hours, that's where he went. Nancy never claimed to have all the answers. She didn't pretend to know exactly what happened in those last moments. But what she did have was context. A clear view of the patterns, the mood changes, and the quiet signs that others might have missed. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a family member. She was someone who'd been there, every day, for years, watching, listening, remembering. That perspective gave weight to her words when she eventually shared them. She wasn't trying to change the narrative. She was simply filling in the gaps. And what she gave us wasn't a scandal or a conspiracy, it was a human account. A memory of a tired man asking for water. A familiar voice at the bottom of the stairs. A home that had seen it all. Over time, Nancy became something of a legend herself. Not for what she said, but for what she didn't. Fans knew her name. Dedicated followers of Elvis's life and legacy often mentioned her as one of the few people who had stayed loyal, one of the few who hadn't sold their story. And that, in a way, made her voice even more powerful when she eventually chose to use it. In her final years, something began to shift. Nancy grew more reflective. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the fact that most of the people who had been there with her were now gone. Or maybe it was simply the feeling that if she didn't speak soon, her memories would disappear with her. She started talking more openly, not to the press, not to large audiences, but to people she trusted. Friends, colleagues, and a few listeners who knew how to sit with quiet truths. What she said wasn't dramatic. It didn't point fingers. It didn't try to rewrite history. It added something else, something more human. Nancy spoke about things she'd never put in writing, observations she'd kept to herself for decades, things Elvis had said to her in passing, behaviors she had noticed in his final weeks, patterns that, at the time, didn't seem like much, but in hindsight carried weight. She talked about the pills, not in the way tabloids did, but in a way that showed how routine it had become. Not chaos, not addiction in the way people often imagined, but structure, a schedule, pills for sleep, for energy, for pain, administered, managed, controlled. Elvis had doctors around him, but Nancy admitted it didn't always feel like care. It felt more like management. Still, she was careful. She never said Elvis wanted to die. In fact, she said the opposite. He was tired, she told one friend, but he was still in there, still trying. That was something she repeated more than once, that he hadn't given up, that he wasn't gone yet. Not really. The turning point came during a quiet gathering, when someone asked Nancy a casual question. They were talking about Elvis, and someone asked if there was anything she'd ever wished she could say publicly. Nancy paused. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I don't think he died the way they said he did. Not really." The room went quiet. No one was sure what she meant at first, but she didn't leave it hanging. She started explaining, not in a rush, but slowly, carefully. She talked about that last morning again, the one where he asked for water. This time, her words had more weight. She described how he drank it quickly, like he hadn't had a proper drink in days. She said there was something in his eyes that morning, a kind of focus, like he was trying to reset. Then she said something she'd never shared before. "I always said he was sick," she began, "but I'm telling you now, Elvis was not ready to die." She wasn't emotional when she said it. Her voice didn't crack. It was just calm, steady, final. She didn't say it for attention. She didn't expect anyone to publish it. She just wanted it out there, even if it was only said once. Nancy talked about how Elvis had begun to pull away from the people managing him, how he was reading more, asking different kinds of questions. He was talking about leaving, not dying, but leaving the fame, the spotlight, the expectations. She remembered him saying, "I wish I could just be a man again. Just a man somewhere quiet." That line stayed with her, because it wasn't something a man says if he's given up. It's something someone says when they still want to live, but differently. She recalled how in those last few days, Elvis wasn't acting like someone at the end. He was restless, yes. He was tired, but he was also making plans. There were conversations about getting away, about changing things. Not in public, not in front of crowds, but privately, quietly. There was still movement in his thoughts, still hope. She spoke about the books he kept upstairs, books on health, meditation, religion. She said, he was looking for something, not in the pills anymore, somewhere else. Nancy didn't romanticize it. She didn't pretend Elvis was healthy or carefree. He was in pain, she said. He'd been hurt by people he trusted. He was bloated. He was sleeping in pieces, on and off. He had too many medications. I'm not saying he was fine. but I am saying he was trying. That distinction mattered to her, because the common story about Elvis is that he died because he stopped trying, that he gave in to the pressure, to the fame, to the excess. But Nancy didn't see it that way. She believed he was still holding on, still looking for something better. She said, "They say he overdosed, but I think he was exhausted. Not just his body, his spirit too." It wasn't a grand theory. She wasn't pointing to a secret or a hidden message. It was about tone, about intention, about how the story had been flattened over the years into something easier to explain. Before she passed, Nancy shared one final memory that she hadn't told anyone before. A few days before Elvis died, he'd asked her something. "Do you believe people can start over?" And she said yes. He didn't say much after that, just smiled a little. "Maybe I will," he said. "Maybe one day I'll wake up and leave all this. Just disappear." He'd laughed when he said it, like it was half a joke. But Nancy always wondered if part of him meant it. She told this story not with sadness, but with clarity. It wasn't about building suspense. It wasn't about rewriting history. It was about adding something that had been missing. A reminder that Elvis Presley in his final days was not lost. He was looking, that he was not silent. He was thinking, that he hadn't stopped moving. He was trying to find a way to keep going. In the Elvis community, among the lifelong fans, the collectors, the researchers, word began to spread slowly. Nancy's comments didn't come in a press conference or a formal interview. They surfaced through conversations, recordings, and personal accounts. She hadn't gone to the media. She hadn't written a new book. What she offered was simpler and maybe more powerful than that. She just talked. Finally, people listened. Her words didn't challenge the facts of Elvis's death, but they reframed the meaning of those final days. For decades, the dominant version of events had been straightforward. Elvis died because of drug use, poor health, and years of fame that had taken its toll. It was a story that fit easily into the public narrative, a cautionary tale of a superstar brought down by excess. But Nancy's version suggested something more complex, something more human. She didn't deny that Elvis was unwell. She acknowledged that he was struggling. But she also believed he was still fighting, that he hadn't given up, that the world had flattened his story into something simple when the truth was anything but. Fans who read or heard about her reflections began to look at things differently. Some rewatched his final performances, looking for signs that maybe he was trying to push forward. They revisited interviews, off-the-cuff comments, even handwritten notes he had left around the house. Small things started to feel significant again. The detail that he had been playing racquetball the night before he died, the fact that he was still booking tour dates, the way he asked for water that morning instead of food. All of it painted a picture not of collapse, but of someone still trying to move forward, if only just. Nancy's reflections had that effect. They didn't scream for attention. They didn't demand belief. They simply allowed for a new layer of understanding. In telling her story, she made room for people to imagine Elvis as more than a tragic figure. She showed him as a man who was tired but still reaching for something more. Her closest colleagues, former staff, and even a few people within the Presley family quietly confirmed that Nancy had always been cautious about what she shared. One former coworker put it plainly. She didn't say things unless she meant them. That's just who she was. That consistency made her voice credible in a way few others were. For the people who had always followed Elvis's story, her words hit differently. They weren't trying to shock anyone. They didn't rely on drama. They were gentle, clear, honest. And because of that, they stuck. There were those who remained skeptical. It's natural, especially with someone as famous as Elvis. When new details emerged so many years later, some people ask why they weren't said sooner. But even the skeptics had to admit, Nancy Rooks had nothing to gain. She wasn't looking for a book deal. She didn't sell her story to a network. She wasn't trying to become part of the story. She had simply lived it. And now, With her own life nearing its end, she was choosing to share what she remembered. Among biographers, researchers, and dedicated fans, her reflections sparked thoughtful discussion. Some began to ask new questions, not about conspiracy, but about what had been missed. Was there a deeper reason behind Elvis's behavior in those final days? Was he really planning to disappear quietly, to leave behind the pressures of being Elvis and just be a man again, somewhere far from Graceland? Nancy's words didn't answer those questions completely, but they opened the door to a new perspective, one that saw Elvis not as a man in free fall, but as someone quietly seeking peace, someone who still had hope, even if he didn't yet know what to do with it. In the days after her comments became known, online forums dedicated to Elvis began lighting up. Fans exchanged thoughts, memories, and interpretations. Some shared their own experiences of visiting Graceland, wondering if they'd ever sensed that lingering energy Nancy once mentioned, that feeling that Elvis's spirit hadn't completely left. Because Nancy didn't just talk about the past, she also shared what she felt in the years after Elvis's death. She stayed on at Graceland for some time, often working late at night when the house was empty. And in those quiet hours, she claimed to feel his presence. Not in a dramatic or haunted way, but in a familiar one. Lights flickering, a soft tug at her foot, a feeling of being watched, not with fear, but with warmth. She told one story about lying down for a nap in the trophy room, where his suits were on display. Half asleep, she felt someone tap her foot. She sat up, looked around, but no one was there. "Mr. Elvis," she said aloud, "I know that was you. Now stop messing around. I got work to do." For Nancy, those moments weren't supernatural. They were simply part of the bond she still felt. Elvis had been a huge presence in her life for a long time. He had trusted her, relied on her, and spoken to her in ways he didn't with many others. So to her, it made sense that some part of that remained, even after death. Others who had worked at Graceland said similar things. Strange sounds, odd movements, small, unexplainable happenings. But they all said it the same way Nancy did, with a kind of casual acceptance, as if Elvis had never fully left, as if the house still carried a piece of him, woven into its walls. Whether or not you believe in that kind of thing, Nancy's stories struck a chord. Not because they were spooky, but because they felt real. They reflected the kind of quiet, personal connection people had with Elvis. Not the icon, but the man. As more people heard Nancy's reflections, the reaction became less about the mystery and more about the meaning. Her words didn't change the timeline. They didn't undo what had happened. But they added heart to a story that had often been told coldly. They reminded people that Elvis wasn't just a legend burned out by fame. He was also a man who, in his final days, might have been trying to find his way out of the noise and back into himself. For Nancy Rooks, that was the truth she had carried for decades. And when she finally shared it, she wasn't trying to make a statement. She was simply letting go of something she'd held close for a very long time. In the end, her voice gave fans something they didn't expect: closure. Not by solving a mystery, but by giving it a little more light. She offered a view of Elvis that was fuller, softer, more human. A man who wanted rest, not escape. A man who hadn't stopped hoping, even when everything else seemed heavy. And in doing that, Nancy reminded us of something important: that behind every myth is a person. And sometimes, the ones who know them best are the ones who spend years saying nothing, until the world is finally ready to listen.